Sorry if I look really shiny in this video. It's all the sweat. So I haven't watched the Rocky Horror Picture Show in absolutely ages, probably 7 or 8 years. I last watched it at some point during uni. A couple of my classmates and I ran an LGBT society, and every so often we would organise film screenings. We watched a lot of films that I wasn't a fan of. Chief among them was the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Even at the time, it was a film I'd seen before, probably 2 or 3 times. And for whatever reason, I just never really clicked with it. For reasons I've never really been able to discern. I've never really clicked with LGBT cinema in general, even though I'm LGBT, and especially I've sort of never been able to vibe with trans cinema, even though I'm a trans person. I always figured it had something to do with that, but for whatever reason, it's always been like extra true for Rocky Horror. And then a little while ago, like a couple of weeks ago, a colleague asked me if there are any films that are widely beloved and really highly regarded that I fucking hate. And one of the first ones I thought of was this film. But then I struggled to really defend it because I've never put all that much actual thought into structuring my thoughts on the film. I've always sort of just thought it's a transphobic film made by a big transphobe. So that's what I told them. But that's not even the whole story. You know, I think there's only one good song in the film. I don't think a lot of the performances are good. I think visually the whole thing looks kind of bad and tacky. But then my main point that I feel like the film is transphobic was something that I couldn't really defend, something that I found I couldn't really make an argument out of. And so it made me want to sit down and write my thoughts out and figure it all out. And it didn't even require a rewatch because luckily the events of this film live rent-free in my brain, no matter how much I try to repress them. And so lucky for us, I can remember almost the entire film in excruciating detail. So let's get into it. Let's spill the tea. This has got sparkling water in it. The Rocky Horror Show is a musical with music, book, and lyrics written by Richard O'Brien, and it was produced by Jim Sharman. It started in 1973, and then in 1975 it was adapted into a feature film called The Rocky Horror Picture Show. It was directed by Jim Sharman, and he co-wrote it with Richard O'Brien, who also stars in the film and in the show. Speaking of which, I just spilled water on my lap. Speaking of which, several actors reprised their roles from the musical in the film, and then lots of new faces were also brought on. To quote Wikipedia for a second, the musical tells the story of a newly engaged couple getting caught in a storm and coming to the home of a mad transvestite scientist, Dr. Frankenfurter, unveiling his new creation, a sort of Frankenstyle monster in the form of an artificially made, fully grown, physically perfect muscle man named Rocky. I would like to begin a segment now that I like to call I'm just going to tell you what happened in the film. This won't be exhaustive. I'll skip a lot of details. Brad and Janet are a newly engaged couple and they get stranded in the cold and the rain with a flat tire. They look for a phone and they approach a nearby castle and they're greeted by Riff Raff, played by Richard O'Brien. They're brought inside and they're introduced to a whole cast of wacky characters, and they soon meet Dr. Frankenfurter, who is not just a cross-dressing bisexual mad scientist, but also an alien. I don't know why I said it like that. Now, to bring something up really quick, Frankenfurter is referred to pretty much everywhere as a transvestite, which is an outdated term, but it just means a man dressing up as a woman. This is how he refers to himself in his introductory song. He also says he's from the planet transsexual, which is also an outdated term, but this one specifically refers to transgender people. So there's been a lot of contention surrounding whether he's supposed to actually be a transgender character or not. I would argue that he is. He's from the planet transsexual, which implies a planet of transgender people, right? You know, a lot of the contention surrounding this stems from the fact that he uses transvestite and transsexual sort of interchangeably, or that he refers to himself as both, even though they mean super different things. And my response to that would be that Richard O'Brien himself largely conflates the two because he's a big transphobe. But I'll get into that more in a little bit. Frank says he's discovered the secret to life, and he brings to life a tall, muscular, handsome blonde man named Rocky, who he intends to improve into an ideal, perfect man within a week, and who he made so that he can fuck him. A delivery boy who half of his brain has been used to create Rocky, played by Meatloaf of all people, breaks out of a deep freeze and breaks into the best song in the film, Sword of Damocles. And when Rocky starts like vibing along with the song and having a good time, Frank gets really jealous and kills Meatloaf with a pickaxe. He then takes Rocky to the bridal suite, and you'll never guess what he does with him in there. He fucks him, I reckon. Incidentally, in the song where he talks about like desiring Rocky carnally and loving his muscles and wanting to turn him into an ideal man, Frank says, "I don't want no dissension, just dynamic tension." So just bear that in mind, because that's good. Brad and Janet each sleep in separate rooms because they're engaged and not married yet, and so they've never had sex. And Frank sneaks into both of their rooms separately. He imitates Brad when he visits Janet, and he imitates Janet when he visits Brad, and he makes sexual advances upon them. And even though they both openly resist him at first, eventually they just sort of give in and do it. Janet is very upset about having lost her virginity to Frank. And then when she finds out that Brad also had sex with him, she feels betrayed. And so because of all these confusing, upset feelings, she decides that she's also going to fuck Rocky. Frank discovers that Rocky is missing, and then he learns that an intruder has entered the building. And the intruder is Dr. Everett Scott, the uncle of Meatloaf's character and Brad and Janet's former science teacher, right? He now investigates UFOs for the government, and he's there to look for his nephew, who, as we know, is dead. The gang then discover Janet and Rocky together, which pisses off Frank and Brad, and then the gang is summoned to dinner, where they eat meatloaf. I'll skip a lot of what happens during and after the actual dinner scene itself, but it results in Frank capturing Brad, Janet, Dr. Scott, Rocky, and a character called Columbia and freezing them all into statues. He then dresses them up in cabaret costumes and then unfreezes them so that they can perform in a cabaret show with him. Richard O'Brien's character Riff Raff and another character called Magenta show up, and they tell Frank that he's failed his mission. Riff Raff declares himself commander, and he kills Frank and Columbia. Rocky retrieves Frank's corpse and then kills himself. And then Riff Raff and Magenta say that they're going back to the planet Transsexual because they come from the same planet as Frank. And they warn the others to leave before the castle flies away. So the survivors crawl away through the dirt and the fog, and the narrator says that human beings are essentially insects. And then the film ends. So I'd say that there's a lot to unpack there. Obviously, we have the content of the film, but looking at the cast and crew is very revealing, and the historical context is also obviously really pertinent. Like I said before, because of the use of the word transsexual, I think Frank is supposed to be a transgender character, but in a much more real sense, I think it doesn't matter at all. And the reason I don't think it matters is because of the real-life opinions of Richard O'Brien, one of the weirdest people I've ever heard of. Now, to be clear, Richard O'Brien is a transgender person. He doesn't identify as non-binary from what I can tell, and he goes by he and him pronouns, but he is a transgender person. He says that he's a third gender or somewhere between male and female. In 2013, he said that he considers himself 70% male and 30% female. And then a few years after that, in 2017, he publicly supported comments made by Jermaine Greer and Barry Humphries. Now, for those of you that are unaware, Jermaine Greer is probably, or at least until a couple of years ago, was the most famous TERF in the world. In 1997, she tried to have a transgender physicist denied entry from an all-women's college because she was born male. And then in 2015, when she was scheduled to speak on campus at a university in Cardiff and the students tried to have that cancelled, she reiterated in an interview that she doesn't regard transgender women as women. And then she also said that nominating Caitlyn Jenner as Glamour Woman of the Year was misogynistic. So, big piece of shit. She's terrible. Barry Humphries is, among other things, an actor. One of his most famous characters is Dame Edna Everage, who is a woman, and she is a satirical comedy character, and obviously she's played by a man. She's played by Barry Humphries, who in 2018 referred to gender affirmation surgery as self-mutilation, said that transgenderism in general is a fashion, and as a result of that, a festival award named after him was named something else. Richard O'Brien, trans creator and writer and star of both the Rocky Horror Show and its film adaptation, supported these statements. In 2016, he stated of trans women, "You can't be a woman. You can be an idea of a woman. That's a huge jump, and I have all the sympathy in the world for anyone who does it, but you aren't a woman. And then as recently as 2020, which is like crazy recent, he said, I think anybody who decides to take the huge step with a sex change deserves encouragement and a thumbs up. As long as they're happy and fulfilled, I applaud them to my very last day. But you can't ever become a natural woman. To be clear, I don't care that he's transgender. Like, I care in the social sense. Like, I'm glad he's comfortable with his gender. I'm glad he's got it figured out. I'm glad he knows what's going on there. But I don't care in the sense that it doesn't make him any less of a transphobe. Internalized bigotry is a huge and common thing. Marginalized people are bigoted towards their own groups constantly. And Richard O'Brien is a perfect shining example of that. So the character of Frankenfurter was created and written by a transphobe, by someone who thinks that if you're not born a woman, you can never become a real woman, and who supported statements made by a man who performs in drag and said that that doesn't make me a woman. That's not what a woman is. He supported that guy. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that trying to discern whether he's supposed to be an actual portrayal of a trans person is arbitrary. Like, it's overthinking it, because Richard O'Brien himself explicitly conflates the two, like both in his real life and in the writing of Rocky Horror. You know, Frank uses both words in the same song and even in the same sentence. So the distinction doesn't matter. He's a caricature of a trans person, and he's also bisexual, which is great and raises a whole bunch of extra problems. Bisexuals are already painted with a negative brush and stereotyped as being promiscuous, and this isn't helped by the fact that Frankenfurter is endlessly horny. He's interested in nothing but mindless sex, and he'll fuck like anyone and everyone, including both members of this couple that are in the film, even if they don't necessarily want to. Which is great, especially because, you know, bisexuals are also stereotyped as being predators. So Frankenfurter embodies trans stereotypes, he embodies bisexual stereotypes, and he is an absolute horrible monster and the villain of the film. Primarily, I want to concern myself with the sexual assaults. Like, okay, they're not explicitly sexual assaults, but there's a lot of dubious consent in this film. He tricked his way into Brad and Janet's beds by pretending to be their partners, and then when they openly resist his advances, he just sort of persists until they go along with it. It's sexually coercive at best, and that's being very charitable. There's also the line I drew attention to earlier where he says that he doesn't want dissension, which is just Frank saying that he wants to fuck Rocky really bad, he desires him carnally, and he doesn't want him to say no. Which, terrific. During the scene where all of the characters are turned into statues so that they can perform a cabaret with Frank, all of their clothes are just magically zapped off. The statues are just naked. Why? I don't know. Like, the film is already horrifyingly horny, but the vibe is really offset by the fact that the whole film is really consensually dubious. Frank is a predator, and he's a manipulator, and he's an abuser. In general, I feel like the message of the film is very weird. Excuse me 1 second. In general, the message of the film is very weird. Janet and Brad are this classic repressed straight couple who have never had any exposure to like LGBT spaces or to LGBT people. And they sleep in separate bedrooms because they're not married yet, and so they're not having any sex. And then Frank introduces himself into their dynamic, and he has sex with both of them, even though neither of them really seem to want to. And then after that, it's depicted as a bad thing. Like, Janet is really cut up about it and confused and upset, and like I said, when she finds out what Brad did, she feels betrayed, and that's never really challenged or resolved. You're just sort of left with it. When everyone performs in the cabaret with Frank at the end, none of them want to. They're forced to by threat of being turned into statues. The film concludes with other characters from Frank's home planet warning them to get out of there because otherwise they'll be taken back to the planet of transsexual with them. And the characters do escape because they don't want to go there. It's a film where they become increasingly immersed in queer culture, where they encounter all these queer characters. They're exposed to unconventional sexual experiences, and Brad has sex with a man in lingerie, and then there's the cabaret show at the end, and it seems like they hate every second of it and spend most of the film as prisoners, and then they escape. because they've had a taste of that life and they don't want anything to do with it. Like, it's this horrible, offensive mess where the characters are forced to engage with a culture that they're clearly really uncomfortable with. And rather than the story being about them getting over that and sort of becoming more comfortable with it and learning to enjoy themselves, maybe learning something about themselves as people and as a couple. Instead of that, they escape at the end after the character that forced them into it is killed. And that's the framing for this story, where a young straight couple are exposed to queer culture for the first time. LGBT people are literally depicted as aliens, and they get almost no real characterization of their own because the film is told through the perspectives of these two straight characters. That's all really bad, obviously, and again, it's a result of the show and the film being written by someone that's transphobic. In fact, several of the cast are bigoted against LGBT people in general, in one way or another, like Meatloaf, who was renowned for his politics being very bad, and for being a bigot, and for his open support of Trump. And then, even though he only plays a small part, Christopher Biggins is in the film, and he is a gay man who opposes gay marriage because it's just for straight people. And then on top of that, it's a film that's mostly performed by cishetes. I know that this was the 70s, I understand that. And the discussion surrounding whether or not, LGBT characters should be played by actors that aren't LGBT is a discussion for another time. That's not the topic that I'm here to talk about. But I think one of the risks of filling your cast with people that aren't LGBT is that if parts of your text, parts of your project are passively or actively bigoted against LGBT people, people with less of a nuanced understanding of the community and its issues might not realize that. A lot of the cast might go into the film not understanding that the film is bigoted, especially when it's spearheaded by Richard O'Brien, when the whole thing came from the mind of a transgender person. Like, if the creator of the show is trans, then you as an actor signing onto the project wouldn't expect it to be transphobic, right? So that's why I think that's an issue. I think the show and the film having so few LGBT people involved, and when it did have them involved, they chose LGBT people that are specifically like homophobic and transphobic, resulted in a story that was bigoted against gay and bi and trans people. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, historical context is very important as well, so I want to touch on that a little bit. The show and the film came out at a time where same-sex marriage was very much illegal, and the nuclear family was a lot more of a norm and much more of an expectation than it is today. But in the 60s and 70s, there were huge countercultural and sexual liberation movements, and the West End absolutely played a part, and the Rocky Horror Show absolutely played a part. To quote Wikipedia again, it was one of the first popular musicals to depict fluid sexuality during a time of division between generations and a lack of sexual difference acceptance. The musical and the film were huge for LGBT people, both out and closeted, because it was this like unabashed, fun, bright, exciting musical depiction of LGBT characters, and that had never been seen before. A writer named Alice Collins said in an article, which I'll link below, that the movie was the first depiction of a trans person that they ever saw. LGBT people gravitated towards the film and the show in the 70s and onwards because it created sort of a safe space for them. Audience participation was a huge element of this, and people would show up to performances in cosplay, and acting troupes at cinema shows would stand in front of the screen and act along with the characters on screen. To quote an article posted in An Injustice, which I'll also link, the festive veneer gave people social permission to dress up in gender non-conforming clothing. Larry Weisel, quoted in the same article, said, "I know a lot of people whose lives were saved by this movie, especially for those in the LGBT community. It's a place where they could be themselves and find people who were their family." And for a lot of the 20th century, this was one of the only places that LGBT people could just openly present and be themselves. Something that isn't really explicitly stated anywhere, but which I take from this, is that because of the huge amount of liberation it gave to LGBT people, and because of how exciting and groundbreaking it was to see a character like this on screen, it didn't actually really matter that much what the story was. Like, it could have been any story told in any way, but it was significant because trans and gender non-conforming characters were on the screen and they were singing and dancing, and it gave its audience, largely made up of closeted LGBT people, permission to dress up and join in. Thing is, I don't live in a time where this is the only example of LGBT cinema around, or the only LGBT representation in film, or in a time where, you know, the Rocky Horror Show is the only place that LGBT people can go to feel safe and comfortable and have fun and present openly and feel like they're in a community. That's just not true now. And yet this film is still huge in LGBT circles and in LGBT communities and spaces. Like I said, we put a performance of this film on for the LGBT society that I ran like 7 years ago. LGBT people still love the film like equally, and I think it's for the same reason, or at least a similar reason. I don't think people care so much what the film is about so much as they care that it's historically significant. They celebrate and appreciate it for being one of the first films to ever depict a trans person, and for being a fun romp that they can sing along to and enjoy themselves and revel in, like, I don't know, the queer joy of it all. Probably, I guess. As you can probably tell from what I said earlier and from the way that I'm talking about it, this is something that I don't really get. It's something that I've never really been able to engage with. But that's what I understand the LGBT community's adoration of this film to be. Like, based on what I've observed and the LGBT circles that I've been a part of myself, like, it's kind of mindless fun where you're celebrating the fact that you're LGBT and you're watching LGBT people on the screen, and you're just having a good little time. The problem I have with it the first time I ever watched it, like 9 years ago when I was about 17, is that other gay movies exist, other trans movies exist, and a lot of them are a lot better. And a lot of them, and especially the most recent ones, aren't really bigoted and aren't full of stereotypes and don't present, you know, trans and bi people horrifyingly offensively. I understand that in the 70s, you had to be very ready to forgive the terrible representation and the stereotypes and the promiscuity and so forth, because you had barely any other representation on screen, if any. But now, I don't get it. Of course, I still understand, you know, wanting to ignore certain negative aspects of a film or coming to terms with them, resolving it so that you can enjoy watching it still. Like, I appreciate the desire to turn your brain off and watch a film mindlessly and just have a fun little time. But personally, for me, with Rocky Horror, the issues are so damaging and so blatant that I find it impossible to do that. And as fun as it undeniably is, and as much as some of the music is probably all right, in the culture that we currently exist in, where so many better alternatives exist for me to watch and engage with, I don't understand why I would ever feel compelled to watch this again. Maybe it's partly just because I don't think the music is very good. Maybe me just not really appreciating the artistry of the film contributes to it. I am a Star Wars fan, so I absolutely understand watching films critically. Like, you have to be mindful of the bigotry in the stuff you're watching, but you're very much still allowed to enjoy it, obviously. And of course, that's true for Rocky Horror. There's an interesting subreddit that I found while I was Googling around looking for stuff about this, and I'll link it below. And a lot of the comments have this exact message and this exact vibe to them. We know it's got its issues, but it's historically significant and it's fun, and to a degree we're willing to let all of the issues slide. We can quietly ignore the problematic parts, which again, I get. And of course, LGBT people can enjoy it, especially if they get something from it, if they gain something of value from it, or if they feel validated. But I guess the reason I struggle to do that is because it's written by a transphobe. The premise and the plot at their core are transphobic. Its problematic elements go all the way down to its roots, and you can barely get through a single scene without something explicitly transphobic happening, frankly. For me, it also just doesn't matter that it's historically significant, and this is something that I've said before, not on my channel, but something that I've said about a lot of stuff. I was saying to my partner quite a long time ago now that I don't like Green Day's music especially, and a lot of that conversation involved me pointing out that lots of people will remind me that it's historically significant and that it changed, you know, the rock music industry. And I know that's true. I know Green Day changed music forever. I know the music industry today wouldn't be anything like what it is without their music and without their influence. Much like I know that the film industry and the theatre industry and queer cinema and queer theatre in general wouldn't be where they are without Rocky Horror. And something that I've heard a weird number of times is this argument that I ought to enjoy it on some level at least, or I've even heard people say I have to enjoy it on some level at least because it's so influential. And yes, I've been forced to admit that Good Riddance is actually a really good song, right? But I don't think that's true at all. Just because something's influential doesn't make it good, and it doesn't mean I have to like it. And part of this is definitely because, you know, the older a piece of art is and the further you are away from it and the longer it's been since it came out around the time that you start consuming media, the more newer stuff you've already engaged with that was directly inspired by it. By the time I started listening to Green Day properly, and by the time I finally saw Rocky Horror when I was a teenager, I'd already engaged with tons of stuff that was inspired by them, or ripped off from them, or even directly referenced them. And so by the time I got around to finally engaging with the piece of media that started it all, it didn't really pack that much of a punch for me. Green Day and Rocky Horror were unheard of around the time of their original releases, right? But that's not true now. And so I wasn't really affected because neither of them really had anything to them that I haven't seen elsewhere or that I haven't even seen done better elsewhere. Also, though, that's not even just accounting for personal taste. An album can change the shape of the music industry forever and also just not really be music that I like listening to. A musical can change the world, and I can simply just not like the songs in it. Also, though, stuff can just be influential and bad at the same time. Birth of a Nation was influential, and it did a bunch of stuff that had never been seen in cinema before, but it's also just a horrible, horrifying, racist mess through and through. And I'm not trying to equate the two films. I'm not trying to compare Rocky Horror to Birth of a Nation. I'm just trying to demonstrate here an example of something that undeniably was a game changer in its industry and had massive influence, but was also fucking terrible. Sometimes stuff is just rotten to its core, even if it makes big splashes in its genre, and Rocky Horror for me is a big example of that. As well as being of very little artistic interest to me, it's just deeply transphobic on almost every level. I can't deny that it's had a huge cultural impact. It's no surprise to me at all that LGBT audiences still want to engage with it and celebrate it as the first film of its kind and as a historically important piece of LGBT cinema, which it undeniably is. And like I said before, I do completely understand if audiences, and especially queer audiences, want to just turn their brain off and have mindless fun watching a fun musical and having an entertaining time being LGBT with their LGBT friends and enjoying this celebration of LGBTism in a community. I get it. And if you can do that, then that's wonderful. And I'm not trying to take that away from you, and I would never dream of trying to. You know, I'm not trying to stop anyone from enjoying a film they like. I'm not trying to cancel Rocky Horror. I'm not trying to cancel Richard O'Brien, even though he's a big piece of shit. And if you do love it, if you're a big fan of the Rocky Horror Show or its film adaptation, then I hope you keep loving it. I hope that doesn't, diminish. And I'm sincerely glad that it adds something of, genuine value to your life and that you can find something in there that you connect with as an LGBT person. But it's also fucking just such a bad film.